Welcome to another installment of Enter Iowa's Outdoors. Today we're going to be kind of talking about a little bit of what I use as far as terminal tackle, the things I use to go out and rig up for some of these large catfish. We fish on two different types of rivers. One is a small river from around here. It's less than about 5 miles away from our house. It's the Wapsipinicon River. We also fish in the Cedar River, which is a larger river, not quite as big as the Mississippi or the Missouri. It's a little closer to like the Rock River up in northern Iowa and places like that. A little bit bigger, but not very big. We produce some of the biggest catfish around in Linn County. We have been fishing for a while since I moved here about 6 or 7 years ago, and in that time I've seen some people pull out some 50-pound plus flathead catfish out of the Cedar. I've watched some people pull out some 50-pound plus catfish out of the Wapsi. I've also caught some pretty large channel catfish from both rivers. So this is kind of our setup and how we set up our terminal tackle box. If you notice, I've got my weights up here, and a lot of my weights run in the 3-ounce range. I can just keep adding weights to my rig depending on the current strength. And what I like to use is these little weight sliders. They're made by Team Catfish. They are basically a large snap swivel that you can attach to your line, and you can add or subtract how much ever weight you need depending on the amount of current. So those are pretty handy. Not only that, but when you're done fishing, you can actually take your weights off of your lines when you hook your reel back or your rods back up, and you're not bending the crap out of your rods because you have a whole bunch of weight on them, like if you had one of these no rolls on. So it's a lot less stress on your rod, particularly to be able to take your weight off of them. So that's another piece of equipment that I really like, is these sliders. We also have bump stops. These are a little bit better than your traditional bead. Your beads and your bump stops are made to ensure that when you have weight on your line, your weight isn't banging up against the knot on your tackle. So these basically protect your knots to keep them from trying to mess up your knots. So I have some 6/0 circle hooks. These are Gamakatsu. I really like these. They seem to hold a nice sharp point. These are for smaller mouthed catfish, like channel cats and bullheads and things like that. They can fit this smaller hook in their mouth. I also have some 8/0 Gamakatsu circle hooks. These I use mostly when I am targeting fish over 10 to 12 pounds. They can get that wide hook in their mouth, and it's pretty easy to hook up on them. I also use some smaller kale hooks. I've got some other kale hooks here. These are nice because you can actually set the hook on them. If you have fish that aren't running as hard with the circle hooks and not getting hooked up as much, you can switch over to these kale hooks and you can actually set the hook on them if you need to. I also use a lot of snap swivels. These can be used to be tying 3-way rigs. You can use them to attach weights if you need to in place of a sinker slider. You can use these as a weight slider if you need to. I use barrel swivels, mostly barrel swivels, particularly for some of the bottom fishing rigs, the straight bottom fishing rigs that we use. We use a lot of these swivels. We also use a 3-way swivel. These have been lifesavers sometimes. We use them for when we're getting a lot of turtles. A lot of you catfishermen know that every now and then you'll catch a lot of turtles. Every now and then you'll have a lot of turtles steal your bait. So what these do is we rig these up to where the bait is off the bottom. When a turtle is crawling across the bottom, he has to stick his feet in the mud and work his way through current up to your bait, sticking his feet down in the mud. Now, if you raise that bait up a little bit farther off the bottom, he'll have a harder time grabbing onto that. So we try to if we end up getting a lot of turtles, we start to three-way rig and we start hooking up on a lot more fish. So now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of talk about some of the knots I like to use. And when we do that, we are going to use some of this high visibility fire line. One of the greatest knots I use, particularly when attaching my hooks, is a snell knot. And there's a lot of different ways to tie a snell, but I like the no knot snell the most. The no knot snell goes through the front of the eye, just like this. Goes through the front of the eye. I feed a little bit of line through. I pinch the line on the back of the shank, and then I just start wrapping. I just start wrapping and wrapping and wrapping and wrapping. I can wrap as many times as I want to, and then I will clip this end and then just run this end up and through the eye, and all it does is, when I run it up and through the eye, is it cinches this whole thing down up and through the eye. Now when I want to, here we go, we'll get our buck knife out, we'll cut this off, and we'll tie a true one. So we'll cut that off, we'll tie a true one. So I come back up and through the eye and cinch it down. Now that right there is a really tough snell. That is not going anywhere. Looks nice and neat. Not only that, but if I want to take this hook off, a lot of the other different snell knots, you'll have to cut these wraps around the hook off. But with the no knot snell, all you have to do is feed your line back through, unwrap it, and you take the hook right off. So for me, the no knot snell is pretty much a no-brainer. That's one of my favorite knots. Second favorite knot is the Palomar knot. So you make a loop with your line, run it through the front, get you a better view here, run it through the front of the hook, you make a square knot, like so, then you take the end of your hook, you run it through that big loop, cinch it tight, and there's your Palomar knot. You can use that to tie leaders, to swivels. You can use that to tie hooks straight to your main line. So really, really like the Palomar knot. So I've rigged up one of my basic rigs to kind of give you an idea of what I use as far as a rig to be able to go out and catch some of these catfish. Everybody does everything different. This is just the way I do it. And what you'll see here is this is our main line. We're going to be using our 30-pound fire line as our main line going to our reel. We've got a 3-ounce no-roll sinker. What these no-rolls tend to do is they sit on the bottom just like they're sitting right there. And water and debris and everything from the river can wash over top of this thing and not move it as much, as opposed to something like an egg sinker, where if it gets sideways or anything like that, it'll start rolling down the riverbed. These no rolls tend to stay a lot more flat, and they'll stay nice and hooked onto the bottom. What I end up doing is I put a bump stop right here above my weight. This bump stop will protect this Palomar knot right here on this swivel. It'll keep that weight from banging into that knot and damaging that knot. Next, we have a large barrel swivel. One of the biggest reasons we use a barrel swivel is, for one, to stop the weight, and for two, to make sure that when that catfish grabs onto that, what they tend to do is they tend to roll. Catfish will death roll, is what we like to call it. So they'll roll around, and what we want to do is we don't want to put twists in our line. So as that catfish is rolling, that swivel is working to keep him from rolling around too much and tangling up our line. Right here at the other end, I've basically just tied a double surgeon's knot, and then I use I run my hook through it and just do a standard loop right through the swivel. What that allows me to do is, if I decide I want to change sizes of hooks, change sizes of leaders, or anything like that, I can just run this back through the loop and pull the whole bottom end of my rig right off, and I can save this terminal tackle for later. So this is Berkley Trilene. It is 30-pound test, big game monofilament. I use that along with this 30-pound Fireline, because the Fireline technically has a little bit more tensile strength than this monofilament. This monofilament will break before this Fireline does. So if the hook does get caught on something, if I do catch this hook on the bottom or anything like that, and I give it a tug to break it off, I'm probably going to get my sinker, my bump stop, and my swivel back. I'll probably lose right there, all that. So we're trying to save as much terminal tackle as we possibly can. So I've got about a foot of leader right there off to and it's got a no-knot snell on it. I no-knot snelled a A-dot circle hook. And that's what we use for catching pretty much every catfish that we catch. Just an A-dot circle hook. So that's just one of the ways that we tend to rig our lines up. This is mostly just straight bottom, but you can also drift with this. By that I mean you've got your boat, you throw it over the side of the boat, you run it all the way to the bottom, straight underneath the boat, you reel it up to where this hook is just barely hanging off the bottom. And then you just unanchor your boat and just drift with it. And if it drifts by a catfish, he'll come up and he'll grab it. So this is not just a bottom fishing rig, this is a drifting rig. The other thing we tend to do is, if we're fishing in heavy cover, if we know that there's rocks or anything like that on the bottom, what we tend to do is we shorten up the amount of leader line that we use. The closer it is to this, because this is what you're feeling going across the bottom. You're feeling that bumping, all the rocks, all the vegetation, all the logs that are down there. You feel this bumping up against them. So as it's bumping up against them, you don't want a whole lot of leader line back here to get snagged, because this will be moving around back here. It'll be moving around trying to catch everything while it's in the current. You want less movement of your leader line and of your bait behind that if you're fishing in heavy cover. So that's just a little glimpse of what we use. Let us know if you guys think of any other rigs that we can show you. I'll show you a couple more here in this same video. I'll show you how we do a three-way. We do a three-way rig, and I will also show you a couple other rigs that we use to keep our baits somewhat suspended off the bottom, particularly when we want to keep them away from turtles. So stay tuned and we'll rig up another rig and I'll show you that. So here's another rig that we tend to use to catch some of these big cats on the cedar. The cedar has a lot of muddy bottom. So this is kind of our muddy riverbed rig. What we have here is we have our 30-pound Fireline mainline. We have our sinker slider. Remember I showed you that earlier in our terminal tackle talk. What this does is, like I said, it slides up and down kind of like a no-roll does, but at the same time I'm able to change out my weights as I need to. So right now I have a 3-ounce bank sinker on there. Usually that's about all I need. These bank sinkers do a pretty good job of sticking to the bottom. Not only that, but I can adjust however many of these I want to put on there to how swift the current is. When the river starts coming up, it's usually the best time to go out and get some of those big flatheads. So sometimes the river tends to get a little bit fast. So at the most I've ever had to put on was 6. So 2 of these guys, 6 ounces. That was the most I've had to put on to keep this on the bottom. So from there we go to a nice bump stop to protect that one Palomar knot right there. We go to a large barrel swivel then to another Palomar knot on the leader line. Then we have about 27 inches of leader line there to an 8/0 Gamakatsu circle hook, and you can see that it has an offset shank there too. That helps in hooking the fish a little better with these circle hooks. So there's another rig that we use. This is primarily a bottom fishing rig again. You could also use it for suspend drifting if you wanted to. Like I said earlier in the video, another good reason is you can take this weight off completely, and then you can stick this in your hook keeper on your rod, reel your reel down to where it's just tight enough to keep your hook in the hook keeper, and you don't have to worry about your bending over your rod or your rod bouncing up and down and your hook coming out of the hook keeper with a whole bunch of weight swinging around. You can just take your weight off, stick this in your hook keeper, cinch your rod up, and you're good to go. Don't have to worry about it at all. So that's one of the advantages of this Team Catfish style of rigging right here. I really like this. I use it primarily if I want to fish on the bottom, on the direct bottom. I don't tend to use a whole lot of no rolls, but they do have their purpose. So this is my main go-to rig for Cedar River catfish. So here's one of my favorite rigs that I like to use if there's ends up being a lot of turtles present. This is called a 3-way rig, and obviously it uses one 3-way swivel. Here's your main line coming down to your 3-way swivel. This goes to your rod. Now you have it depends on where you want to fish in the water column, depending on how long your leader is. But here's where your leader comes off, and it goes to your bait with your hook on it. This will be trailing off this way. Think of the water flowing this way downstream. Then you use a smaller pound test line. I use the 30 because it's all I got down here right now in the gun dungeon, but what I tend to use is about a 10-pound line for this sinker. I run it down to a swivel clip, and this swivel clip is then connected to the sinker. By doing this, instead of just tying it straight to the line, I can adjust how much weight I need to hold this on the bottom. Or what I like to do with this rig is I like to walk it into structure. I will throw it out there right in front, upstream of the structure I want to be fishing. I will then use my pole up to jig up and down and use my bail to let out line, so this ends up bumping its way back into that structure. Once I feel the bait hit something, I want it to sit there. So I use about a medium amount of weight as far as that's concerned. Usually end up with about 2 to 3 ounces depending on the current, but usually somewhere around there. I use 10-pound test line right here on this one because this is what's hitting on the bottom. This is what's going to get hung up. So if I do get this hung up, that 10-pound test line will break before this tackle will. So then I get all the rest of this rig back if I do hang it up. This also helps to keep it off the bottom, away from turtles. I fish this rig with my rod tip up, because then that will pull this swivel up in the water column and it'll hold it there. That swivel being up like that will allow this bait to sit off of the bottom. Another way you can help do that is you could either put a float on your main line right here to hold it more in a straight up and down fashion, or if you want it to lead out a little farther, you can put your float on your bait line. You put it right somewhere around here. The whole rig will sink, but that float will want to keep this hook and this bait off the bottom. So that's our 3-way rig, and that's what I tend to use when there's turtles or I'm fishing heavy cover. I will I will usually tie on this rig. It's not my favorite rig to fish because you will get stuff tangled. Your sinker line sometimes gets tangled with your bait line and stuff like that, but that's one of the reasons we use a 3-way swivel. This swivel will keep your lines from twisting and turning around, and a lot of the times if these two lines do get tangled, this will sink straight to the bottom. This line will pull out with the current, and watch that swivel. It will just correct itself. See that? See how it just corrected itself? That's why we use swivels, because sometimes a tangle will definitely correct itself out. So, like I said, that's one of the ones that we like to use. Not my favorite, but I will use it when I have to. So the final rig I'm going to show you is one that my grandfather taught me how to tie. It was a long time ago in the early 90s. I was just a kid, and we were sitting on the side of the riverbank, and I was catching a whole lot of carp. And he was catching a whole bunch of catfish, and I was like, well, what's going on? Why is he catching so many catfish, and I'm just catching a whole bunch of these carp? And I went over to him and I asked him about it, and he showed me one of the biggest reasons why I was catching carp is because I was fishing just dead straight on the bottom with night crawlers. So he showed me how to tie this rig, the rig that he was actually using, and what I found was that this rig was deadly on catfish. There's no special tackle that you need to use to rig this rig up. You pretty much use your entire main line as your entire rig. So there's no whole bunch of swivels up here and things like that. So you use just your main line. What you do is you take your main line and you tie a snap swivel to the bottom of it. Right there. So you can change your weights. From that snap swivel, you run up and you make a loop. From that loop, you run out a small leader with a Palomar knot right there to the end of your hook. This main line then goes up and you attach a float. This float will hold everything pretty much straight up and down, and this will sit about a foot off the bottom. This float is not the most integral part of it. You could use it or you could not use it. It doesn't really matter as long as you keep your line tight. It'll hold it off the bottom, but this float helps. It helps a little bit. One of the things you have to make sure of is that you have enough weight to sink this float. With a float this size, I would say anywhere between maybe 2 ounces would sink it at a decent rate to get it on the bottom. So this is another rig that you can keep it out of the way of the turtles. So those turtles if those turtles end up snatching your bait off your hook a whole bunch, or you start catching a bunch of them, this is a good way to keep the turtles off your bait and not keep your bait off the bottom. So this was an awesome rig for me when I didn't have a giant tackle box full of a bunch of really cool terminal tackle to make all these complicated and crazy rigs. I used to just tie this, and I used to catch a lot of catfish. He taught me so much about fishing, and this is one of the things I definitely have remembered about it. So that's our final rig. I hope you guys like this little series. We want to continue to keep doing this for you guys. So if you guys like this, if you guys have any suggestions, if you guys have any comments, be sure to comment at the bottom of the video. Be sure to hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe to the channel to get more of this awesome content. Until then, we'll see you guys in Iowa's Outdoors.